Hi, Dan.
Hey Bob, how are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm realizing that it's the time of day that light is hitting me from outside a little bit, so I hope people don't mind if I look a bit mottled for a few minutes.
It's a good look, and it will probably only get better. You know, in the very early years of Blogging Heads TV, we had Ross Douthat on, and he had a situation where his face was just slowly obliterated as the sun set, and he was aware of it, but he just didn't know what to do. I mean, literally, by the end, he looked like a being from outer space. You could barely see eyes. It was great. And he, of course, went on to become a famous columnist for the New York Times. And this may happen to you. Well, listen, I'm looking forward to this conversation for a few reasons. One is that you, like me, are a host on the bloggingheads.tv/meaningoflife.tv platform. You got a show called Sophia, which is about philosophy, of course. Another is that we have some announcements for the community, the Blogging Heads Meaning of Life community. In brief, and I'll save the discussion of this mainly for the end, but in brief, Meaning of Life TV is now on a new technical platform. Things will look largely the same. Pretty much all the functionality will be there. And I'll explain later any senses in which you may have to rediscover some of the functionality. But by and large, the experience will be the same. But we are now using a YouTube player on the site. And that means a few things. I think it's basically good for our audience, good for us. It should lead to fewer technical glitches for reasons I will explain. It should make sharing on social media easier. Like, for example, on Twitter, the actual video will now appear and play in Twitter if it's coming from the YouTube player. And also, I think it'll expand our audience for reasons I will explain, although I certainly encourage people watching on the Meaning of Life site to continue to watch on the Meaning of Life site.
There will be in other words, you'll be able to. If you watch it on the site, it'll be a YouTube player, but you'll also be able to go on YouTube. There'll be a YouTube channel that you can go to and watch it. Is that what you're saying?
That is correct.
Okay.
And there's actually, when we discuss this at the end, there's a connection between those two things that I'll talk about a little. Okay. Now, in the short run, this will be true only of Meaning of Life, not on Blogging Heads. That may be slightly confusing. Blogging Heads will be converted, we hope, in a month or two to the same deal. But there will be some slight interface differences as a result of that, and I'll explain all those. But anyway, I'm happy about this. We've worked hard, and in particular, Brian Degenhart, who's our tech guru, among other things, has worked very hard to not only make the shift, but preserve the functionality that's distinctive to our site. And I will get into all this. But in addition to this, the other reason I'm excited is we're going to talk about a lot of interesting stuff. Most of it emerging from this essay that you've written on your site, the electric Agora. Is that the way you pronounce that word? Agora?
Agora.
Is it?
Yes.
You sure? Because I thought it was Agora.
Am I going to swear by it? I've always pronounced it Agora.
You know what?
You're probably right, and then I don't want to embarrass myself.
Now, you know what? I had always pronounced it Agora, and 5 minutes ago I Googled it and clicked on the little audio thing, and the guy said Agora.
Well, then I would never distrust Google.
I would never distrust the guy who speaks when you click the audio thing. We have a long relationship. But who knows? Anyway, it of course refers to, I guess, the square in Athens where deep ideas were discussed. And this is a site where you publish stuff sometimes, and you have published an essay on Joan Didion, the writer, and discussing the essay will lead to a discussion of all kinds of things, I think. Second wave feminism, maybe the new journalism, and maybe Hunter Thompson, maybe Bret Easton Ellis, all these people kind of figure in one way or another. Moral relativism, nihilism, but in particular, one thing that really interested me that you talk about is the differences between the generations. You know, millennials, Gen X, baby boomers. You have a theory about that we'll get to.
Yeah.
Why don't you start out? There may be a lot of people like me who have known all their lives. They should know about Joan Didion. Like I remember, here are my experiences with Joan Didion. Once in college, I was procrastinating. I was in some library, and there was a copy of her novel, Played as It Lays. and I read like the last part of it, and I think I remember it.
You read the end?
Yeah, just the end. I didn't want to procrastinate too much, and I kind of think, and maybe this is something I'm conjuring up having read your essay, but I think I remember the ending being kind of like decidedly inconclusive in a certain sense. Intentionally not resonant. You know what I mean? Like not resonant in an old-fashioned novel way.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's all I remember. And then I remember when her book, The White Album, came out, which was roughly the same year. I'm old enough to remember not only her book, The White Album, coming out, but The White Album coming out, the actual Beatles' White Album coming out, which was about 10 or 11 years before that. And I read about that in the New York Times Book Review, but I don't, I've always had her, there's this list of people like her and Susan Sontag, and I know I should know more about them. I don't. So first of all, why don't you tell us what's important about her? Is she, first of all, is it, would you say novelist / journalist or novelist / essayist or what?
Yeah, I mean, I would say novelist / essayist. But she was also a journalist, but she was a journalist in the mode of what's now called the new journalism. She was not a traditional journalist. And if you want, we can talk about what that sort of means.
What does it? I think of the new journalism as meaning, for one thing, a kind of a you are there journalism that was somewhat defiant of traditional journalistic standards and maybe a little self-referential. It was legitimate to talk about the journalistic process. Yeah.
So I'm happy to sort of say a few words about it. So the new journalism, I most identify with three people: Tom Wolfe, Hunter S. Thompson, and Joan Didion. They're not the only ones. Gay Talese is another. Norman Mailer is another. Norman Mailer wrote, did work of this sort in addition to fiction. Mm-hmm. But those three are the ones who are most known for it. Probably Thompson is known for it the most. But I would
did you mention Tom Wolfe or
yes, Tom,
you did?
Tom,
okay, yeah.
Tom,
I think of him as just synonymous. I mean, when I think of the new journalism, I think of him as kind of the paradigmatic case.
And he actually edited a book called The New Journalism that had
maybe that's
excerpts and pieces from this genre. I would characterize it in terms of two basic characteristics. The first is it eschews any pretense at journalistic objectivity. Mm-hmm. And it's not just that it eschews it because it's skeptical about it. In other words, this is a problem that that teachers have, right? So you're a professor, especially in a subject like philosophy or political science. Do you tell your students what your own views are, or do you try to hide them? And the conventional wisdom is, well, you should hide them because if you tell your views, then it's going to skew the student's perception and so on and so forth. I disagree with this. I always tell the students exactly what I think because they know that I think something. And if I try to hide it for them, it's more likely they're going to go looking for it. They may get it wrong. And they're very likely to impute things to the things I say, motives to the things I say, that may not be there. If they know what I think up front, they're perfectly capable of figuring that in when they interpret what I say, right? Mm-hmm. And the new journalist had a similar sort of attitude about journalistic objectivity. There's no such thing. We know that now, right? And why even bother to pretend that there is one, right? Instead, we'll just write out, right? I'm Hunter S. Thompson. I hate Richard Nixon. I think he's the devil, right? Mm-hmm. And now I'm going to do my reporting. And you can figure that in when you read what I write. And you can, you're not stupid. So one thing is this eschewing of the pretense of journalistic objectivity. The second is the insertion of the journalist into the narrative.
Right.
Thompson's famous piece on the Kentucky Derby, which I strongly recommend, and I'm going to provide Bob links that people can read this stuff. Most of the stuff is available. It's absolutely wonderful to read. His piece on the Kentucky Derby is really about him and Ralph Steadman going to the Kentucky Derby. It's not about the Kentucky
Ralph Steadman was the illustrator.
That then was with him for years and years, and illustrated many of his books. The story really was about Thompson and Steadman at the Kentucky Derby and watching the people watching the Kentucky Derby. It really wasn't about the Kentucky Derby itself. So that's the second element that I would say is really a characteristic of the new journalism, is the insertion of the journalist into the story, to where the journalist is part of the story and may even dominate the story. To talk about Didion, if you read the essay Slouching Towards Bethlehem, or you read the essay The White Album, she is a main character. It is her meeting these various people, going through these various experiences, and describing them from her point of view.
So was the White Album the title piece of the book called The White Album? That was like an anthology?
Right. Remember, all of these books, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, The White Album, then much later, After Henry, Political Fictions, these are collections of pieces that had already been published elsewhere. Published in places like Harper's or The Atlantic or Esquire or I'm not remembering all the places, but she published in a lot of places. If you buy one of these anthologies, it'll tell you every single place that these pieces appeared in. So these are collections. But the main essay in each also bears the title of the collection. Mm-hmm. So Slouching Towards Bethlehem is the main and largest essay in that collection, and that also is the collection bears that name, and the same thing for the White Album. So anyway, so Didion, I would say, is both a novelist and an essayist in the style of the new journalism. Mm-hmm. And most of her stuff is published in magazines. Okay.
Yeah. So you, in this essay, which I think is called Nothing Matters? No, it's, what's it called? It's,
Nothing Applies.
Nothing Applies.
This is a line from Play It As It Lays.
Right. And it's largely, the essays uses Play It As It Lays in particular, and would you say it, there's a line that caught my attention early about her line. Well, it's from the book. We tell ourselves stories in order to live. Which, is true. And then it gets into the question of, well, what if you can't take the stories seriously? What if, which becomes kind of like saying, what if you're, you tell me, is that the same as saying, what if you're borderline nihilistic? You're wondering whether there really is a larger meaning or any absolute values, or wondering, are we talking partly about kind of moral relativism and nihilism here?
Well, these pieces are connected, but I think in order for clarity's sake, we need to sort of identify each of them. Mm-hmm. One thing is her view on narratives, and she has, in the essay, I say one of the things that's really hard about writing about Didion is that so much of her work is characterized by kind of ambivalence, right? And so, on the one hand, she thinks narratives are absolutely necessary in the sense that we feel a terrific need to be able to view our lives and our activities as part of some story that has a kind of an internal logic to it, and that at some point at the end will in some way vindicate us, right?
Your life will add up to something in the way.
She also, though, is of the view, she's very dubious, A, that these stories are true, mm-hmm. and B, that it's particularly good for us to hold on to them. The fact that you think you need something or desperately want something doesn't mean it's good for you. And certainly in the book Play It As It Lays, which is, look, it's not a didactic book. It's not a book where she's presenting a theory of any kind. Right. But certainly, you certainly get the impression. The only person who really comes through the book, she comes through damaged, but she does come through, is precisely the person who no longer believes in these narratives and who just plays the game of life. Without expectation, without a story to sort of fill it all in.
This is the character Maria in the book?
Yeah, Mariah Wyatt. Yeah.
And then there's another character who also kind of lets go of stories, but winds up in a more depressing place, right? Kills himself.
So I don't know whether, how do you feel about spoilers?
Well, the spoilers in the essay, so I don't know.
You're right. Fair enough. So, the book, near the end of the book, her best friend, the only person who she's really close to, commits suicide. And he commits suicide because he has finally come to understand that the narratives are false and is devastated by it, right? And the narratives in this case have to do with post-World War II, American dream, California, film industry, make it big, make it rich, sexual revolution, all the sort of the elements of what we would take to be sort of, you know, stardom and success in the post-war era.
And he loses faith in the value of these things. He just comes to think it really doesn't matter.
Right. He comes to realize that it's all terrible, right? And look, throughout the book, you come to, you know, it's hard not to see how terrible it is. The sexual liaisons are meaningless and predatory. The business end of it is dirty and disgusting.
This sounds like more of a critique of a particular culture and lifestyle than questioning whether there is meaning anywhere, right? I mean, it's an indictment of a set of values that are actually pretty easy to indict and are commonly indicted, right?
Right, but you know, that's just the novel. This theme recurs in her other writings, in her essays, and also even in the novel. If you read the opening sequence, which I reproduced in the essay, at least the character of Mariah does generalize this point. You know, she says, why does a coral snake require 2 glands of neurotoxin to survive, whereas a king snake, which looks exactly like it, requires none at all? And then she goes on to repeat a story of a couple being killed by a coral snake. And so, you know, this is a classic, typical sort of thing, right? This happens to you. Let's say these are your parents, and you say, well, why did this happen? And you look for a reason, right? You look for something to make it meaningful, so it's not just empty and pointless. And so I think by the examples that Mariah gives at the beginning, the intent is that this is a general point, not just one about California, Hollywood, fast living sort of lifestyle. It's meant to sort of apply, I think, to everything, right?
Yeah. And we all do have stories about ourselves and like what we're good at and why our lives have value and what we hope to have accomplished by the end. And
right,
I don't actually want to lose all those stories personally.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, who wants to lose them? The question, you know, I think that what Didion's doing, and again, she's ambivalent. So she's not. This is not a skeptical essay, right? She's ambivalent. I mean, she recognizes the need for it. She recognizes what they do for us, but she also recognizes that they're probably false. At some point, you're going to find out they're false, and the question then is, how do you handle that? How do you cope with that? And it's very hard to cope with. Now, there's a connection, but one thing. There's a connection between this point about the narratives and the stuff that she wants to say about morality. But it's not a seamless sort of connection. I mean, so, you know, if you want to move to talk about her views of morality and stuff, we can, but it's not a seamless run from this point about the narratives to the point about morality.
Okay, you're right. So it doesn't necessarily imply moral relativism, you mean?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
You know, it's interesting. No. I don't want to get too far into this, but you know, I spend a lot of time kind of in the culture of Buddhist meditation, mindfulness, and this idea of questioning the stories we tell ourselves is very much a part of modern day mindfulness practice. I don't want to say it's so much a part of Buddhist practice traditionally, but certainly contemporary Western mindfulness, it's fairly explicit in, and there's a connection with traditional Buddhist practice and philosophy. I mean, it's just more, I think, the idea that, you know, of observing your narratives and not following them mindlessly is very much a part of modern mindfulness practice. And kind of interestingly, and I think not totally unrelatedly, in Buddhism, the question of nihilism arises and has arisen for a long time about Buddhism. The question of whether there's the danger of acquiring such a, you might say, objective view of all your impulses and your intuitions about truth and so on, might lead you to question whether there's any kind of truth at all, any kind of moral absolutes at all. So we needn't dwell on that, but It kind of occurred to me.
But I think that's very interesting. I mean, we all are familiar with the concept of a useful fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also worth being warned a little bit about how we think of those fictions and that we remain aware of those fictions. I mean, look, there are, of course, harmless fictions. The one that I mentioned at the beginning of the essay about, where me and my longest standing friend first met. Mm-hmm. Neither of us can remember, and at some point in our childhood, we came up with a story about where it was, which I'm sure is false, right? But A, I know it's a fiction, and B, not very much rests on it, right? Mm-hmm. It does provide a nice sort of story. It provides me with a sort of, and it's something that if I'm not thinking about it too hard, I actually half believe, right? This is something we tell to each other as well as to other people, even though we both know it's false. I think that Didion at some level understands that there is no getting rid of all the fictions. I mean, the character of Mariah is in many ways not a character you'd want to be, right? There's no way of no getting rid of all the fictions, but there is a way of not losing oneself in the fiction, mm-hmm. and there is a way of not constructing fictions that are so central to your capacity sort of to live and to be happy that when they're unmasked, you're broken, right?
Right.
And that seems to me to be, if you were to take lessons from her, which again I don't think she's trying to do. She's not a didactic writer, but if you were to take lessons from her, I think that would be one of them. Yeah. I think it's a good one.
I think the claim of a lot of proponents of modern mindfulness teachings would be that really critically interrogating your narratives can actually lead to a fully more mentally healthful situation. Whereas in this book, it sounds like you've got two people who question the narratives. One of them commits suicide. The other kind of finds a way to survive, period. Right. But it's not like, as you say, not necessarily recommended that you try this at home.
Right. And there's a lot of, there's many dimensions to the book and to the character. And one of the dimensions that really explains how she's able to do this is that she comes from a family of gamblers. Mm-hmm. So she essentially has a gambler's ethos and thus expects that at any moment she may go boom or bust. Right. And in a sense, these are tough people, right? Because they have had to get used to being completely devastated in a moment, right? And having everything turned upside down on you in a moment. And so throughout the book, you can see her drawing from that background, and it's actually a source of strength, but it's also something that causes her to be completely disconnected from everybody else, right? Mm-hmm. And she is pretty much alienated from everybody else in the book, especially her ex-husband, Carter.
Uh-huh. Now, this book features in a course you teach there at Missouri State that, you're in the philosophy department, but it's a course that draws on, I guess, literature and journalism. And you also, if I remember correctly, there's a Bret Easton Ellis reading. Is that right? And he, that's another person. I know I should have read him. But the thing about him is, when Less Than Zero came out, I remember what a sensation it was. And all I remember about that is it was about, his generation, which would have been Gen X, I guess, Gen right? X. And they were, if I remember the reviews correctly, they were essentially nihilistic, thrill seekers, and I remember thinking that he had so overdrawn the portrait that it just seemed to be done for the sake of shock value. I just remember reading what these people were supposedly doing and thinking, are there really many people who do this kind of stuff? Right? They were. Am I misremembering?
Well, it was. So let me say a little bit about this. I'm a huge fan. I actually wanted to talk. I want to talk to him on Blogging Heads, but I have no idea how one gets to such a person. I might email you privately about that.
Well, when someone's book comes out, their publicist is a good way.
But so let me just say something about Less Than Zero, and let me say something about Ellis in relation to Didion. So, I would, if you were to ask me, what voices best define the ethos, the character, the sensibility of Generation X, I would say there's two. One is Bret Easton Ellis, and the other is John Hughes. And in many ways,
the director,
one is a negative of the other. Uh-huh. John Hughes, the filmmaker, right.
So remind us of his key
John
movies.
Hughes. Oh, The Breakfast Club.
Right.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Pretty in Pink. 16 Candles. I mean, movies that are just sort of ubiquitous, were ubiquitous in the popular culture, and they still are. My daughters watched all these movies.
So you were in what, your early 20s or late teens when they came out?
I was born in 1968. No, I was in high school. These movies were made when I was in high school.
Your teens.
Yeah. I was the audience,
right,
for these films. So if you ask me to sort of say, which voices best capture the sensibility of Generation X, I would say Bret Easton Ellis and John Hughes. Now, they're almost entirely opposite. One is extremely dark, and the other is much more optimistic. And I think that's pretty much gets it right. The 80s, which was the time when Gen X was in high school, was both a time when young people and teenagers had attained the highest level of social capital that people that age had ever acquired. You now had mega stars who were 15 years old, 16 years old, Brooke Shields and her Calvins, Molly Ringwald on the cover of Time magazine. I mean, this was unprecedented. Mm-hmm. Teens had achieved a tremendous amount of social capital. But it was also the time when some really dark youth behavior and youth phenomena began to happen. It's the time when the divorce wave hit really the hardest, and you just had half the youth population essentially with broken homes.
A term that is no longer acceptable, but
I'm old. But
it was when I was growing up. Yes.
The older I get, the more I enjoy being able to say I'm old to get myself out of trouble.
Yeah. It gets better and better, believe me.
So I think Ellis does capture a very real element of that generation and that time, but it's only one element of it. It's only one part of it. And also, to be fair to him, it's very specifically about the rich children of the film executives.
Yeah.
That's who it's about. That's where it's set, and it's the world he comes from.
Right. So it has that in common with Play It As It Lays. The cultural context is related.
Right. Now, the connection with Didion. Now, this is interesting. First of all, Ellis cites Didion as his number one influence. And it's easy to see. If you read Play It As It Lays and read Less Than Zero, you'll see the stylistic affinities immediately. For one thing, Didion is a minimalist. She one of the reasons why I think she's such a great stylist is that she's able to communicate a tremendous amount, not just of information, but of emotions and feelings with the least amount of words. It's really astonishing how she does it. And Less Than Zero is written in a similar minimalist style and has a similar effect. He does a lot with very little. And also the deep ambivalence of the protagonist is very similar. And I think that one of the explanations for this, and I talk about this in the essay, is that not just that Ellis had a stylistic affinity for Didion because he liked that mode of writing, but I do think that there is a generational affinity between Ellis and my generation, Generation X, and the generation that Didion comes from, which is, of course, the silent generation.
Because they were your parents, basically.
That's right. They are our parents, right? And Didion actually talks, one of the quotes that I have that's in the essay is from where she talks about the effect that her generation had on her sensibility. And when you read it, she could easily be talking about Generation X.
Now,
and then a very strong contrast with, on the other hand, the baby boomers and the millennials.
Right. So your theory is... So your theory is, so her generation was called the silent generation. Your theory is silent generation is to Gen X as baby boomers are to millennials. In both cases, the former parented the latter, and as a result, the latter, I guess, share their values. Now that's an interesting theory. We definitely don't have time to analyze it exhaustively. I mean, it assumes a certain amount of intergenerational transmission of values, which certainly isn't always the case because the baby boomers themselves are often depicted in contrast to their. So, like, I'm a baby boomer, And we are the rebellious. Of course, it breaks down right away when you look at baby boomers of different ages. But a lot of baby boomers, influenced by certainly the late 60s, and some of the late 60s was kind of taking shape. Before that, became rebellious, and the rebellion is sometimes cast as a reaction against the values of their parents. Yeah. But in your theory, the values of the parents are in some sense successfully transmitted, at least in the case of baby boomers to is it millennials and silent generation to Gen Xers.
Yeah, and I wouldn't state it as strongly as you did. In other words, I wouldn't say straightforwardly that there's a transmission of values, because I think that that's probably wrong, and it does fail to take into account the inherently rebellious relationship between children and their parents. I would make a weaker claim, or maybe not weaker, but a less specific claim. I would say that what's transmitted is a kind of an instinctual way of reacting to things or approaching things. That is, it's more the transmission of a modality than a substantial position or view, right? Because look, I mean, the millennials, of course, the form that their various activisms and causes takes, they're very different causes than the ones that the baby boomers did, although there's some overlap. But it's more the ethos, the way of thinking about things.
Right. We can change the world. We can make the world a better place.
That's right. And that problems are always the result. So problems are the result of bad systems. Right. And so what we need to do is, if we fix the systems, we'll fix the problems.
Right.
That is, there's an inherent sort of progressivism, if I want to call it that, in both the baby boomers and the millennials. Forward-looking, can do. Everything is fixable. The only obstacles are our will and bad structures. I
will say, I mean, it's consistent with my experience. I mean, I'm a baby boomer. My daughter is the one who's still in college, very active in prison reform movement, and there's more of that kind of activism on campus now than I think there was 15 years ago.
Oh, way
by a
more.
long shot.
There hasn't been anything like this since the 60s, right? And look, you can see it even between you and I. What do we spend half our time arguing about? Whether there's meaning, right?
Well, but you don't think there's not meaning, and in fact, interestingly, I think you are in some ways more conservative than I am on some of these fronts. But neither of us is nihilistic, right? No, I wouldn't call myself nihilistic, and I also don't think Didion is nihilistic. She doesn't think that it's not that she thinks that there are no morals, but what she takes the morality to consist of is a very basic, what she even calls sort of wagon train morality, that's basically just centered around a few core elements of survival. The example that she gives in that essay that I quoted from, I didn't actually quote this example, but she says, here's an example of an actual moral duty. If someone dies, you don't leave his body out to be eaten by coyotes, right? If you ask yourself why, you probably couldn't give a reason. You couldn't come up with a reason. It's just so fundamental to just sort of the hanging together of a social order. The kind of morality that she's suspicious of is precisely the sort that appeals to our conscience, right? And which she thinks is easily manipulated, and she also thinks is too easy to use as an excuse to impose your will on somebody else by pretending that something is an obligation rather than simply that you would like it. She recognizes that the first kind of morality wouldn't be recognized by most as morality, and so she does sort of come off sounding like a nihilist. But I don't think she is. I just think she thinks that what morality actually consists of is something very fundamental, very basic, very primal, and something about which one probably can't say very much by way of giving rationales. And it's precisely the kind of thing that we normally think of as morality that does have all these rationales and justifications that she's suspicious about.
And I happen to like that also. I mean, I've written a lot of very skeptical essays about ethics as it is commonly understood. But I do also think of myself as caring about morals and as hopefully being a moral person. But I'm not sure that what I mean by it is quite the same as what a lot of people mean by it, right?
Okay. So by way of kind of fleshing her out, you mentioned in our email correspondence your critique of so-called second wave feminism, which is basically second wave feminism is the feminism we're all kind of familiar with in the sense that the first wave was before any of us recall, when it was just about eliminating explicitly discriminatory, legal obstacles like women can't vote, stuff like that. That's first wave.
Right.
Second wave starts in the 60s. The roots are earlier, but it becomes prominent in the 60s. I remember it becoming prominent. I remember watching, do you remember the David Frost show? You know who David Frost is, right? He's in the Nixon interviews and so on. But and including there was a movie about that. But the David Frost show in the late 60s, early 70s was broadcast, syndicated by Westinghouse. So when I lived in San Francisco, I was 12, 13, 14 years old and was watching it. And I remember he had this woman on who was a feminist, and he brought her on like it was a new species. And the funny thing was, he was like totally skeptical. I forget what she was advocating, but I'm sure it's stuff we would not think of as radical now. And she said, and at the end she said, believe me, someday you'll take this for granted. This will succeed. And he said, I remember exactly what he said. He said, something like, this will make sense to me, or that day will come the same day I learned to put the toothpaste back in the tube. In other words, never will your cause succeed. So that cause is second wave feminism. But Joan Didion was a critic of it.
Well, she was a critic of certain dimensions of it. I mean, again, it's hard. I think a lot of the reaction at the time when this was published, and it was a piece published in the New York Times, and it had a pretty big impact, probably because by that time Didion was already a pretty big figure, and I think a lot of people mistakenly interpreted Play It As It Lays as a feminist novel, and so I think there was also sort of expectations that she was going to be on board, and then when she wrote this essay, which not only was critical but was devastatingly critical and so well written, that even if you agreed with second wave feminism, it was hard not to cringe reading this, especially the quotations that she pulls out from people like Shulamit Firestone and some of these other sort of very aggressive activist movement feminists.
So this was in the New York Times in 1972, yes. Right?
Yes,
and you quote this in the piece, and of course we'll link to your essay.
Yeah. You can Google it and you'll find it. It's in the public domain. It's in the archives and you can find it. It's impossible to understand Didion's criticism of second wave feminism without understanding her more general rejection of politics. Because, I said last time there's a connection between her rejection of her feelings about narratives and a bunch of other things. And one of the things that it leads her to, her ambivalence about narratives, is a deep ambivalence about abstractions. And of course, politics is nothing but narratives plus certain kinds of abstractions, and especially politics whose job is to express an ideology, right? Because that's all that an ideology is, right? Is an abstract vindicative narrative, right? Vindicating narrative, and she thinks that all the reality of things lies at the particular, at the level of the personal. She also, because of these other views she holds, rejects the idea of infinite malleability of people.
Right. And of the sexes, of the genders.
That's right. There are facts about the sexes that simply mean that there is a limit to how much one can be like the other or one can be like anything else. That's her view, right? And she expresses it very powerfully. And so her rejection of second wave, her attack on second wave feminism is an attack on it to the extent to which it was an attempt to advance an ideology through a political program, to turn women into a kind of Marxist class, right? to abstract away, to try and deny all these sorts of facts about nature, to try, in a sense, even, I mean, some of the things she quotes are remarkable. I mean, Shulamit Firestone apparently even said, right, well, so much the worse for nature. Let's just get rid of it, right? Mm-hmm. Let's just, we'll use technology to overwhelm it. This refusal to sort of accept anything as given. And I think Didion feels that this attitude is deeply adolescent and infantile, right? Mm-hmm. This notion that I can be whatever I want, and I'm going to make myself whatever I want, and you can't stop me. And even if nature is saying no, you can't do it. Damn it, I'm fuck nature, right? I'm going to go and I think she found something infantile, unrealistic. I think she thinks that it's a very false narrative. It's a self-deluding narrative. And I think she also kind of thought that it was the kind of narrative that you could only sustain if you were a rich, relatively elite white person, but that it was a narrative that could actually really be quite harmful to lower class and working class people. I mean, one of the things about Play It As It Lays is, the reason why people mistook it, I think, for a feminist narrative is because some of the things that happen in the book to the main character, she's very much hurt by some of the sexual relations she has, by the men she encounters. She goes through a harrowing abortion. There's a harrowing abortion scene. And so I think a lot of people thought, well, this is a feminist novel. But actually, she was coming in from the other angle. She was saying, no, this is one of the prices of the free love movement, right? Not everybody is going to feel good after jumping in and out of bed with 50 different people, right? This was about...
And men and women may not, on average, feel the same ways about
That's right, that's right. And so I think that her attack on feminism is very harsh, but I don't think it's an attack on feminism per se. I could see her giving a very similar kind of critique of any sort of political movement that's heavily ideological and that tries to resist or insist that there are no givens, there are no fixed points. Everything is infinitely malleable so long as you have the right theory, right? And she thinks that that's just so far away from the personal, so far away from the particular, that it can only falsify human life, right? It can only give a false picture of human life.
And again, this is kind of consistent with your larger theory. I mean, again, you've said that her generation is characterized by less than complete optimism about our ability to create a wonderful world, and that was transmitted somewhat to your generation, Gen X.
Yeah.
My baby boomer generation was more optimistic, and we transmitted this sensibility to the millennials. And it's true that, last time I checked, the supposedly prevailing sexual ethos on campus was the hookup culture. And that is premised on the idea, implicitly premised on the idea that there are no differences between men and women, basically, in their sexual psychology. Now, right. I'm a little skeptical of that personally. I mean, and I also, I've spent enough time on campuses to actually wonder whether male and female students are on balance equally delighted with everything about it. And actually, if you listen closely, you can hear disenchantment from both sides, I think.
Yes.
But in any event, it's kind of consistent with your. I mean, the hookup culture is an expression of the ideology she was critiquing.
Yeah. But see, because some of that, I don't want to call it traditionalist, whatever you want to call it, some of that criticism of the counterculture overlaps with feminist criticisms, right? And so people could easily mistake Play It As It Lays as a feminist novel, and then they sort of, well, Joan, what do you think of the of Shulamit Firestone and Bella Abzug and all these people and Gloria Steinem and Ms. Magazine? And then when she wrote this, they were like, oh my God. And she was basically, she was savaged for this. Now, later on, the feminist movement came back to her in a sense. A, it became less radicalized. B, many of the really important things it was about got done. And so there was an ability to be a little more generous to someone like Didion. And so later on, you could read interviews with her in Ms. Magazine and stuff like that. But there was a period where she was just, she was an absolute villain in the feminist movement because of this piece. Which, if she wasn't such a good writer, probably wouldn't have gotten her as much hate as it did. But she writes so well that it was even worse, right? It was even a worse attack than if you were sort of a mediocre writer or, the sort of opinion writers you have now, most of whom are not very good writers, it seems to me. So.
Okay. Well, I do want to turn to this discussion of the changes to the website. But first, just quickly, you also teach Hunter Thompson in this course. And
so let me. You want me to say something about
just quickly, because it's kind of, he doesn't naturally strike me as a real high gravitas figure. You don't. There's certainly not a lot of explicit articulation of philosophy. I mean, I read Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail.
Fantastic book.
Yeah, fantastic book. That's his coverage of the 68 or 72, 72 campaign for
the McGovern-Nixon election.
Right, 72 campaign for Rolling Stone.
That's
and
right.
Then Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas is, of course, a novel with the famous opening line.
But also based on real events. In other words, he and Oscar Acosta really did go to Las Vegas.
And if you doubt that he did the drugs that he says he did, all you have to do, and this is kind of sad, I think, but all you have to do is observe him in real life in the later part of his life. I mean, I saw a thing on C-SPAN, and George McGovern was there, and Hunter Thompson was there, and I mean, he could not get a sentence out. I mean, and I know people who I knew somebody who, they had him speak at their college, and, he had these things like, some people have, the demands he had, some people was like the famous one of, I guess, Van Halen, or somebody's like, M&Ms with no brown M&Ms or something. Anyway, his was like, a fifth of wild turkey and blah, blah, blah. And of course, there's that line that I still remember from Fear and Loathing in the Campaign Trail where he describes that he's on deadline, he's got to finish this piece, and he says, so I locked myself in the motel room with, fifth of wild turkey, blah, 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 and enough speed to alter the outcome of 6 Super Bowls. That's the exact line. And, of course, he finally committed suicide, sadly, but I really think his brain had been just about destroyed well before that. So anyway, I do not doubt the authenticity of his narration in that sense.
Yeah, so the course is called Philosophical Ideas in Literature. It's one of the things I was hired to teach. There was no real guidance as to how it would be taught. Prior to my coming, it was taught primarily as use novels to teach philosophy. So inevitably, it wound up being existentialism, because those are about the only philosophical novels there are, or works of literature that there are. And I just find that really tedious and boring, and I'm it's overdone and whatever. So I just decided to do something entirely different and say, how about instead of using novels to teach philosophy, how about instead reading literature philosophically, right? And so what I did was I changed it to that second mode. And the original version of the course was dystopias and utopias. And so I had everything from Brave New World to Clockwork Orange to 1984, things like that. I did that for a while, and it was good. But then I decided, I said, why don't I do something totally different? Let's do something on the American Dream. And so I constructed a course that all of the books about which are about either the collapse of the American Dream, the hypocrisy of the American Dream, the fact that there never really was an American Dream. The books are Nathaniel West's Day of the Locust, Didion's Play It As It Lays, Hunter Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Philip K. Dick's Scanner Darkly, and the last is Less Than Zero. And Thompson, here's the thing about Thompson. I mean, whatever you think about his lifestyle and all of that, I think it's good that there's some people like that. Okay? If everybody was square and healthy, I'd hate it. I think it's good that there's people like that. But the reason why I think he's so important is because he was a critic of the counterculture from the left, not from the right. In other words, he blames the left for the failure of the counterculture as much as he blames Nixon. And that seems to me to be really, really important, because it's not said often enough, right? The picture you get is that, oh, the counterculture is wonderful, these are the forces of light, and then the damn Spiro Agnew set just sort of overwhelmed them, crushed them, cheated, lied, and stole to be, and shot them at Kent State and all that. And then we had the Republican Revolution, and we've been living with it ever since. I don't think that that's really quite true. And neither does Thompson. And Thompson has a lot of credibility on this, right? I mean, and so that book, Fear and Loathing, when you read it, yes, it's full of some really obnoxious sort of excess, but woven in there are some really, really thoughtful, self-critical examinations of the counterculture, which I think are really, really important.
Oh, and his critical eye in general. I mean, the way he lampooned the establishment press corps in Fear and Loathing. I mean, I remember there's a picture in the book. He calls them media wizards. And there's a picture in the book. The caption is "Media Wizards covering the 1972 campaign." It's all these guys at the motel pool lying in these lounge chairs. All these famous journalists. And although I once asked one of the guys who I think was on the very campaign bus, William Greiter, I think, who's a well-known leftist journalist, and he had only the highest praise for Hunter Thompson.
I'm sure you've heard this, but McGovern's campaign manager, Frank Mankiewicz, said that Thompson's book was the least factual and most accurate account of the election given by anybody in the press.
Right.
And that's high praise. I mean, that's high praise.
Yeah.
And it also shows you, just one last thing about the new journalism, the way in which the new journalism does truth, right? It doesn't do it straight. It sort of does it, and I like that.
Right. And I think somebody like Tom Wolfe would probably say that every fact he reports about what happened is actually literally true. Now, Hunter Thompson would take off on what were clearly flights of fancy.
Right.
And in fact, I said earlier that Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas was a novel. Maybe that's not its technical designation, but the ratio of what is manifest fantasy and made up to what is fact is clearly much higher than in the campaign trail.
Right.
But
what it symbolizes, what it represents, what it says at that second level is true, right?
Right.
It's not literally true. This didn't actually happen, but what this sort of represents is true.
Right.
And the Fear and Loathing on the campaign trail certainly does that. I mean, good grief. This whole thing, his persecution of poor Ed Muskie is just one of the funniest things in the world, right? And at the same time, really does give you a sense of how just lame and weak and tired some of these old war horses were that were trying to sort of gather themselves up for this, right? And so I really admire Thompson. And I also think he's a great writer, a great stylist. I don't think he's in the class of Didion as a writer and as a stylist, but anyway,
as always, we shouldn't overemphasize the novelty of things. I mean, I know that John McPhee, who was a teacher of mine, once said, do you know who Joseph Mitchell was, the writer for The New Yorker?
Yeah.
Yeah. John once said, when the new journalists came ashore, Joe Mitchell met them on the beach. And, some of these, with Mitchell, you also had a real...
That's a good line.
Yeah, it is a good line. And with Mitchell, you also had this not complete clarity about what the person had really said. In fact, he had this whole character, I think Joe Gould or something, and I forget whether there are questions about whether the guy existed at all or whatever.
But he's a fictional character, isn't he?
Well, I don't think he was presented that way. I think he was originally... I think when the pieces appeared in The New Yorker, Joe Gould was said to be a guy he met in a bar. I don't know. People should Google it. I may be totally wrong about this, but it's a super interesting story. Joseph Mitchell, who's no longer alive, an editor of mine at Pantheon, who was the editor for my book, The Moral Animal and Nonzero, was the guy who had the inspiration, Dan Frank, to kind of revive Joseph Mitchell. People had kind of forgotten about him, and the collection Up in the Old Hotel was published by Dan at Pantheon about 20 years ago, and people should really read that. I mean, some of those old New Yorker writers are such masters.
Yeah.
Mitchell, A.J. Liebling.
Listen, there was a period in American sort of educated but not academic culture when you just had an amazing array of essayists, right? I mean, and there were venues to publish these things in, right? People like Lionel Trilling and people, really, who was an academic, but whose most important work is not academic work. And I think we're all the worse for that form almost not existing anymore. And I'm sure the New Yorker still exists and stuff, but it does not occupy the place. The days of the Algonquin group are over, right?
Yeah,
and I think that we're the worst for it.
And an interesting question is kind of whether the essay as a genre. I mean, they're around. I mean, look, the thing about the internet is you can find examples of every conceivable genre. It's not like you can't point to an essay, but its place in society and culture.
That's the key. Right. That's the key. If it doesn't have the cultural effect, if its distribution is not wide enough that it can shape the consciousness of a generation of people, then fine, it exists, but what does it do? It doesn't do anything, right? Yeah. And that concerns me. I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about that.
We could.
Why don't you talk about?
Okay, so a couple of things. Okay, so as I said, we are as of this dialogue, I think this will be the first one in the YouTube player.
Okay.
Which means it'll still be on Meaning of Life TV. And we encourage people to stay here and comment here. Now, there will be, as these things begin to get traction on YouTube, which will probably not happen immediately or in all cases, there will be comments on YouTube. My own preference would be that our devoted commenters who are committed to having, a place for intelligent and civil debate, which and discussion, which I think is a description that applies to over 90% of them.
I agree.
Continue to foster that at Meaning of Life TV and at Blogging Heads TV, because it's really a precious resource. It's very important to us. It's very important to our ability to keep attracting, top flight people who want to be seen having conversations here, and so on. And if you've ever looked at comments on YouTube, it's like whoever happened to...
It's a cesspool.
It can be. It depends on what you get, but it's just like, because it's a lot of drive-by traffic. It's not people who have a sense of commitment to the place or to the conversation. But, so, who knows what will happen there if the thing does start to get traction. But I would certainly encourage people to keep commenting here. And I would renew my periodic call for them to do so civilly, respectfully, and so on.
Let me just ask, so nothing will change in terms of, if you go to bloggingheadstv.tv, you will still see the same visual interface, and you will still see the Meaning of Life videos. It's just that when you play them, the player is going to be a YouTube player. It's not going to take you to YouTube, is it?
No, it is not. But a couple of things will change, and let me show them to you. I mean, you're not supposed to do live demos, but I actually have a computer here, and I have the what is now the so-called dev site, because it's not live yet, as we're taping this, although it will be. So here is the home page. I don't know if I can...
I can see. It's fine. You can see.
Although the lighting is kind of weird. Let me turn off a light or something and see if that helps. But so here's the home page.
Right.
I guess the problem is just that... Anyway, that's a homepage. So one difference is, we're not sure if this difference will persist, but one difference may be that when you click on headlines on the homepage, the video, you will be taken to the video page as usual. The video may not begin playing of its own accord the way it does now, but there will be this big play button in the middle of the thing that'll tell you need to click one more time. So that's not a big deal.
You may need to click twice.
You may. We're trying to find a way around that. But if you do, what may seem odd is that you don't have to do that with Blogging Heads videos, which will still be in the Flash format. You will have with this. But it won't be that deeply confusing. I would say the biggest difference is the share interface. I think I'm going to, at this point, switch to just a... I think this is not that visible, so maybe I'll...
No, the stuff in the column is not visible. I can see the...
Yeah, see, the share, a big difference is the whole share interface. Now, we've taken pride in the fact that you can, custom make clips and so on, if you want, for purposes of sharing or embedding. You can set any in time and any out time. We have preserved that. Let me see this. But it looks a little different, and I just want to quickly explain that. Let me, darn, I thought I had an actual, a paper rendering of this, just in case something like this happens. Oh, I know what I can do. Is it, Is it?
Oh, now it's coming into. Now we're starting to see it. Now, can you make it a little more? It's perfect.
Yeah,
now
there we go. Okay, sorry. Okay, that is the share button.
Okay.
Now, when I touch it, yeah, sure enough, it actually happened. A share interface pops up down here.
Oh, that's nice.
And this took real work on Brian Degenhardt's part, but we preserved everything. It looks a little different. So if you just want to share, just share what you're seeing, you can click Facebook or Twitter. And what that will mean is, if you had clicked, if you clicked play entire dialogue to get there, if you're watching the whole thing, then that's what will be shared. If you clicked on one of the topic titles,
and it'll only share that piece.
then it'll only share the topic title.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, and then if you want to get really cute and make your own clip and share it of any in time, any out time, down here is where you will do that. And you probably can't see all this, but you said any in time, any out time, and then you can preview the clip. There's a preview button right here. Wow. You put in the in time and the out time, or you can press these. Like if you're watching the video and you say, I want my clip to start right where it is now, then you press the quote button next to start at, and you'll see the number appear. Anyway, people will get the idea. Anyway, then you preview the clip, and once it's set with the in time or out time, you can, again, either share it on Facebook or Twitter, or the embed code will appear down here. And the embed code, the default embed code will just be for either the whole dialogue or the topic title, depending on what you did. So anyway, people will figure it out, I think. But that part looks quite different from what the equivalent was, and what the equivalent will still be for Blogging Heads videos for a while. And, we really encourage... we obviously encourage sharing on Facebook and Twitter. Sometimes people ask, what can I do to support the site? Well, we don't ask for money, but although, feel free to send it. But
commenting and sharing are the main
commenting ways constructively, participating in the comment section, and sharing things. And also, if in the comment section you're referring to a particular clip and you want to create the clip, the in time and the out time, and show people in the comment section. People do that occasionally, and I love that. So you see the URL that says in at 17 seconds and out and so on. That's wonderful too. So anyway, maybe not all of this was necessary, but
it's a good idea, Bob. I do have a question. Will this affect anybody's subscriptions?
No.
Do people need to resubscribe?
No, you don't need to resubscribe. And I want to remind people you can subscribe. So you can subscribe either, you can subscribe in a couple ways. You can get an email sent to you every time a show appears. You can subscribe to the podcast through a podcast app or through iTunes or whatever. And you can subscribe either to the entire feed, entire Blogging Heads feed, entire Meaning of Life feed, or to a given show, like your show, Sophia, my show, The Wright Show. We encourage that. And, a final thing I would encourage people to do if they want to help is if you could take the trouble to go to iTunes and rate the podcast if you like it. I don't know if it's a 5-star system or what. And this apparently... it helps even more, apparently, if you leave a review. That the existence of reviews in combination with the rating makes us more visible to other people, helps the audience grow, and makes the prospects for the longevity of the site higher. And I think just being on YouTube will have somewhat the same effect.
I agree. It's going to get you viewers. I mean, people who might not have come to the website, who are looking on YouTube, do a lot of surfing on YouTube,
I think that's particularly true for the kind of content you do, which is kind of timeless stuff. Like you did this dialogue on Kant not long ago, which did very well, but it will be more discoverable on YouTube once it's on.
Right. Anybody who searches for Kant on YouTube, it'll come up. And it doesn't matter if it's 6 months later. It's not like it's timely and it won't be relevant anymore.
Right.
When is the actual YouTube channel going to be up?
Oh, it'll be up as soon as we are up.
So that's going to go up at the same time.
Yeah.
This is...
Yeah. And, it may take a while for things to get traction. But one thing we discovered is that actually having the stuff play on our player on site will facilitate the process of things appearing higher in the search rankings of YouTube.
Right,
So,
right.
but an example, we just did this thing. I just did this conversation on the Buddhist philosopher Vasubandhu. Have you ever heard of him? Really,
No.
I would encourage you to listen to this because it's amazing how close it is to Western philosophy in some ways. And this guy lived like 1,500 years ago. And he's considered, aside from the Buddha himself, maybe the most important figure in the intellectual history of Buddhism. And that's a thing that is timeless. And, people do study it. And these timeless subjects, more... So the meaning of life content, in some ways, more than the Blogging Heads content, because the meaning of life tends to be timeless. And that's one reason we're doing it first with meaning of life. That kind of content can slowly build on YouTube and become... more prominent in the search rankings and so on. So that's the logic behind all of this.
Okay. Well, that's great.
Yeah, let me see if there's anything else. I don't think. No, I think the main complication.
So is the next video on Meaning Life TV going to be in this new format?
All videos henceforth on Meaning of Life will be the YouTube format. And by the way, another virtue is that I said earlier there should be fewer tech glitches. One complicated thing about doing video is, when you've got your own player, I mean, we use a kind of a generic player. It's not our own player, but it's a particular player, and we have customized it to do certain things, like the sharing interface. And every time any browser, like, Firefox or Internet Explorer or Chrome, changes something fundamentally, it can screw things up.
It screws up your...
Yeah. And of course, the great thing about YouTube is they probably got 100 people who do nothing but making sure that that doesn't happen, right? And for us, it's just a real strain to be monitoring 4 or 5 different browsers on Windows and not to mention mobile and blah blah blah. So I think people will actually get a better user experience. I hope so. And I think I've said everything I meant to say, but thanks for putting up with all that. And
pleasure. I really enjoyed the discussion. I mean,
No, it was a really interesting essay, and I encourage. We'll link to it, and I encourage people to read it. And I may go so far as to read some Joan Didion if I ever meet all my deadlines. Won't happen.
Very good.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Dan.
All right, Bob. Take care.
Okay. Bye-bye.